Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the San Jose Sharks have re-signed Erik Karlsson to a massive deal, 8 years at $11.5 million. Doug Wilson actually did it. He made Erik Karlsson the highest paid defenseman in the league and one of the highest paid players in the league, only behind Connor McDavid, who is of course making $12.5 million. And so he is $500,000 more per year than Drew Doughty. To be fair, however, when Drew Doughty did sign that deal, it was worth a higher percentage of the cap at the time. Now that the cap is expected to rise up to $83 million, this $11.5 million is not as bad as the Drew Doughty one looked at the time in terms of cap percentage, but still $11.5 million. That is $92 million contract over the 8 years. And I'm sure Doug Wilson had a lot to say that could buy over Erik Karlsson, but it probably came down to the fact that Doug Wilson pulls out his checkbook and says, I can make you the highest paid defenseman in the league right now. Other teams might offer you $11.5 million. They might offer you even $12 million. But the thing about those offers is that a 7-year deal at $11.5 million gets you just about $80 million. Just about $80 million over the 7 years. A $12 million deal for 7 years, that gets you about $84 million. But right here, right now, $11.5 from a team that can offer you 8 years is $92 million. And that is an extra $11.5 in a year where Erik Karlsson, of course, at what age? 37 or so he would be at the end of a 7-year deal. That's certainly a year where he would not be making $11.5 million. So a huge advantage that the Sharks had being able to give the 8th year, and it ended up buying over Erik Karlsson even before the free agent window. I believe teams are only allowed to talk to upcoming free agents in about June 23rd or something like that, to give yourself a week to plan for July 1st or something like 10 days. That window hadn't even opened yet, and Erik Karlsson has already re-signed with the Sharks. So certainly a persuasive message and a checkbook that Doug Wilson showed Erik Karlsson. We saw that the Instagram photo of them meeting over a dinner, so that was clearly one of the most productive dinners of 2019. But now moving on to the Sharks lineup that you have to take into account now that Erik Karlsson, one of their top defensemen, is now making $11.5 million to go with the $8 million that Burns is making and the $7 million that Vlasic is making, which makes their top three making $26.5 million over the next, 5 or 6 years until Burns' contract is over. And so this leaves the Sharks with $13.2 million in cap space. They've got 6 defensemen signed. Technically, Jacob Middleton could be a 7th guy, but I don't know how reliable that is. And then they're still missing 5 forwards to play. Obviously, they can call up a couple guys from the minors, but you need 3 people to play in that top 6, and it seems unlikely the Sharks have anyone who, can actually be expected to do that, even if one of them could surprise and make it there. And so you take a look at the names that the Sharks still have to re-sign. You've got players like Meier, Nyquist, Pavelski. Those 3 players at fair deals would make a lot more than $13.2 million. And so with the addition of Erik Karlsson, the re-signing of Erik Karlsson, Gustav Nyquist seems to be completely off the table at this point. Nyquist will not be a San Jose Shark by next season, because it seems as though if it came down to it, choosing Pavelski and Nyquist, the Sharks would likely choose Pavelski. And so first we should take into account the fact that Meier basically needs to, at this point, take a bridge deal worth about $5 million. That would fill a spot on the first line with Couture, and that would leave the Sharks with just about $8.2 million. At that point, I suspect LeBanc would also get some priority, as he is an RFA, making somewhere around the $3 to $3.5 million range also on a bridge deal. Let's say 3.5 to maybe be a bit fair with LeBanc. At that point, the Sharks would be at just about $4.7 million, which is, of course, not enough to sign Joe Pavelski. So at that point, the Sharks have 5 top 6 forwards, if you can pass LeBanc as that, and they'd be missing out on one. So you can either try and, put like Donskoy if you want to re-sign him, or you really try to get Joe Pavelski and hope he can still play at the top 6 level. He showed last season that he can, and you're going to hope that he can sustain that performance in. but that means you also need to get more cap space. So what I suggested in my cap discussion video a few days ago was that the Sharks would trade Justin Braun to be able to fill that, as Justin Braun has $3.8 million of a cap hit for this last year going into the next season. That would give the Sharks $8.5 million to work with, which would be clearly enough to get Joe Pavelski to sign here. I suspect now that Erik Karlsson has re-signed, maybe Pavelski takes some sort of discount. He might get somewhere around $6.5 million. I suspect it will still be a raise over what he was making on his previous deal, but I don't think he's going to get something like $7.5. So if he can take $6.5, that would leave the Sharks with just about $2 million and then just 2 spots on the third line to fill. And the third line can be a bit more reliable. First of all, you could get Joe Thornton back. Now that Erik Karlsson has re-signed, Joe Thornton could potentially see the fact that the Sharks have yet another chance to go for a Stanley Cup, to try and get Thornton his first cup of his career. And Thornton has been saying for the past couple of years that he would take league minimum if necessary to make the Sharks more competitive. And so I suspect Thornton might take a good $1 million or so to be able to play on that third line center role, and I wouldn't really have much of a problem if he decided to do that. At that point, you're leaving yourself open with just a third line spot. On the wing, you're at about $1 million in terms of cap space, meaning a player like Donskoy is basically eliminated from the equation. As such, what you're likely going to do is have to call up some sort of prospect that the Sharks do have, whether that be maybe you move Karlsson up to the third line and get someone onto the fourth line. You could have like a Gambrell there. You could get Chekovich trying to play on the third line. You could get Shemelevsky trying to play on the third line. The Sharks do have some options, and I suspect some of them very well could make it to the third line and be a decent forward. It is a bit risky, but certainly Doug Wilson and I would say myself believe that the risk is worth it to have kept Erik Karlsson. So while Nyquist is off the table, while Donskoy is likely off the table, while some Sharks maybe defensive depth is a bit off the table, as it's going to be difficult to even afford either Ryan and Heed, who will likely want about $900,000 to $1 million. I suspect probably Heed would get re-signed, especially if Justin Braun gets traded. Heed likely needs to be re-signed. But it's certainly going to be an interesting look for the San Jose Sharks. It's probably going to be a very similar team to what the Sharks had just last season, just players getting paid more dollars. Of course, Erik Karlsson was making $6.5 last season. He's now going to be making $11.5. Meyer was making an entry-level deal. He's now going to be making close to $5 million. LeBanc was making an entry-level deal. He's going to be making close to $3.5. And so the Sharks are going to be at similar power as they were going into the trade deadline. And so you might be thinking, well, the Sharks lost in the Western Conference Finals with a team that would technically be better because they had Nyquist and they won't have Nyquist next season. You would be right about that, but I would say that the best point, the best stretch of time that the Sharks actually looked was from about early December to mid-January, when Erik Karlsson was not injured and was actually playing at a high level past that few bumpy points near the start of the season, and that was before the addition of Gustav Nyquist. So if the Sharks can keep Erik Karlsson healthy for the majority of the next season, and they can get strong performances from them, I suspect we could see the San Jose Sharks that were there from the start of December to the mid of January, at which point they looked close to unstoppable, and I would bet high. I would say that they would be cup favorites going into that one, but again, we've seen in the playoffs that it's not necessarily the best team who wins. It is normally the healthiest and the team that gets the most bounces here or there. Not to say the Blues were lucky, but the Sharks were certainly somewhat unlucky when it came to injuries come playoff time. So if the Sharks can get some good fortune next season, this team could certainly compete for a Stanley Cup and be in the position that the St. Louis Blues are in currently. Class dismissed.